Hey folks, my name is John Lay, and welcome to the Korean Foreigner YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about the movie Peninsula, which is the sequel to the 2016 movie Train to Busan. Before we continue, I have to warn you that this review is going to contain some major spoilers. If you'd like to see a review that doesn't contain any spoilers, I did make such a video a couple of days ago, so I suggest that you check that out first. Okay, now that the warning is out of the way, let's get right into this movie. When the movie starts, the zombie apocalypse has already begun, and people are trying to flee from Korea as quickly as they can. And one of the families that we're introduced to is the main character's family, who is portrayed by Kang Do-won. Kang Do-won's character is an army captain who is driving his sister, nephew, and brother-in-law to one of the refugee ships that is waiting at the harbor. While driving to the refugee ship, Kang Do-won comes across a family whose car has broken down in the middle of the road. They ask him for a lift, but because he's afraid that they might be infected, Kang Do-won leaves them behind and just drives off. The family does manage to board one of the refugee ships, and so it appears that they might be safe. But we are talking about a zombie movie, so of course they're not safe. Before long, we discover that one of the survivors of the ships has already been bitten by a zombie, and so he turns into a zombie and he bites a whole bunch of people. Among those people that the zombies attack is, of course, Kang Do-won's sister and nephew. So far, we've only just talked about the prologue. When the movie starts, it's been 4 years since the zombie apocalypse broke out, and the Korean refugees that we saw at the beginning of the movie are now living in Hong Kong. Kang Do-won is no longer an army captain. In fact, he has fallen from grace. Now, he is working for a crime boss. One day, the crime boss has a job for Kang Do-won, the brother-in-law, and 2 other Koreans. Their job is to return to the now quarantined Korean peninsula in order to find a truck. The truck is important to the crime boss because it has $20 million worth of cash in it. The crime boss promises that whoever's able to find the $20 million will be able to keep half of it. For the Korean refugees who are living in Hong Kong in poverty, this is an opportunity that they just cannot pass up. Now, as it turns out, in this movie, the only country that's been affected by the zombie virus is South Korea. No other country has been affected by it. North Korea is apparently safe from the zombie virus because they're protected by the heavily fortified DMZ. And apparently the zombies can't swim because there are no zombies in China or Japan either. Now, when our scavengers return to Korea, the place has gone to hell, but they do find a truck and they do find all the money. Naturally, there's zombies everywhere. But what surprises the audience in this movie is that there are human survivors in this movie. One group of survivors is made up of a single mom, her 2 daughters, and for some reason they're accompanied by a not altogether mentally there soldier. And as it turns out, that single mom is the same woman that Kang Do-won's character refused to give a lift early in the movie. Small world. However, there is another group of human survivors, and they are an ultra-violent and sadistic former military unit called Unit 631. Now that we've gone over the synopsis, I'm sure that you can understand why I said in my previous video that this movie's plot is somewhat compelling. Peninsula is not just your standard zombie flick, it's also an action-packed heist movie. And if you see the action scenes and the car chase scenes, some of those scenes will also remind you of the Mad Max movies. So what did I not like about this movie that I couldn't talk about in the spoiler-free video? Well, for starters, let's begin with the very beginning. The title. Yeah, I wasn't a big fan of the title. The title of the movie is Peninsula, and so as soon as I saw the title, I immediately assumed that the movie was going to involve both South and North Korea. So if this movie was going to involve South and North Korea and the zombie apocalypse, I imagined that it was going to be a part horror, part sci-fi, part techno-military thriller. I thought that this movie was going to ask some really interesting questions, like how would a democratic government respond to a zombie apocalypse as opposed to a highly authoritarian military dictatorship? Would the South and North Korean soldiers be forced to put aside their differences and join forces in order to fight against the undead zombies? If both South Korea and North Korea were to succumb to the zombies, what would be the reasons? Would the reasons be similar? Would they be different? I thought that this movie could delve into a lot of interesting topics. But instead, North Korea only gets mentioned briefly during exposition scenes. When the movie begins, one of the first things that we see is a late-night talk show, and the host is asking a scientist about the things that went on in Korea. It's basically an exposition scene. And during this scene, they mention that North Korea is completely safe, as they are untouched by the zombies, presumably because the DMZ is anything but demilitarized. Other than those exposition scenes, North Korea is never again mentioned in the movie, so I feel like the title gave me a false sense of expectation from this movie, and I feel like if they had titled the movie anything else other than Peninsula, I might have been a little less disappointed with the way the movie turned out. The second thing that I did not like about this movie was there was this really brief scene that explored racism, and I feel like this was not handled very well. In this one scene that takes place in Hong Kong, Kang Do-won's main character and his brother-in-law are talking to each other while they are in a Hong Kong restaurant. Being Koreans, of course, they are talking in Korean. Now, like I said earlier, these people are refugees who have fled Korea from a zombie virus. And when these two people are talking to each other in Korean, one of the other restaurant patrons hear them speak in Korean and they start to panic. This one guy stands up and he speaks in Cantonese and he says that these guys are Koreans and they're carriers of this deadly virus. Why are they allowed to be served in this restaurant? I feel like this scene didn't do the theme justice, because after all, in the real world, we are living in the age of the coronavirus, and we've all heard stories about Asians becoming the victims of racist attacks because people think that they are carrying the coronavirus when in fact that is not actually true. Had this been a Netflix series that contained multiple episodes instead of a single 2-hour long movie, I feel like this scene might have been given some justice. However, because of the time limits, I felt like this was a missed opportunity. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I often feel that a movie is only as good as its villains. And to be honest, the two actors who portrayed the villains in this movie weren't as memorable as the actor who portrayed the villain in Train to Busan. In Train to Busan, the actor who portrayed the villain, Kim Do-yoon, made himself a really despicable character. People had a visceral reaction to him and people just loved to hate him. Among the two villains in Peninsula, the one who was more memorable was played by Min-jae, and he portrayed Sergeant First Class Hwang. Sergeant Hwang is definitely a bad guy. He is violent, he is explosive, he is unpredictable, he is everything that a bad guy needs to be. But the problem with Sergeant Hwang is that he has no character development, and we don't know what motivates him. He just is. So although Kim Min-jae puts his heart and soul into the performance, Sergeant Hwang is just not as memorable as the villain in Train to Busan. The last thing that I didn't like about this movie was the movie's happy ending. This movie didn't deserve its happy ending, and I'll explain why. Toward the end of the movie, the female lead, who was portrayed by Jung-hyun, has been shot in the leg and she's hobbling toward this helicopter. Now, her two daughters are already at the helicopter, but she just can't make it and the zombies are going after them. And so, in order to make sure that her daughters are safe, she makes the male lead, Kang Do-won, promise that he will take her daughters to Hong Kong. In the meantime, she decides to go over to this nearby truck, where she gets in and she blasts the horn. We have to remember that these zombies are stimulated by sound, and so she's making the ultimate sacrifice to make sure that her daughters are safe. This scene deserves criticism for two reasons. The first problem that I had with this scene was that Lee Jung-hyun's character wasn't really given much of a character arc or much character development before this scene took place. Whereas the rest of this movie was a fast-paced action movie, this scene all of a sudden suddenly had a lot of overacting in it. There was overly dramatic musical scores that were playing in the background. This scene was created for only one purpose only, and it was to get the audience members to cry, and I felt that it was overly manipulative. And as for the second criticism, like I said, this scene ends with a happy ending, and this happy ending was not earned. In order to explain, we need to go back and talk a little bit about Train to Busan. Train to Busan also has a happy ending, but that happy ending felt earned. Now, in the final scene of Train to Busan, you're not sure if this little girl might actually live or die. She's walking through a dark tunnel, the soldiers at the end can't see what her face looks like, and they think that she might be a zombie, and they've got their rifle aimed at her head. They're gonna put her out of her misery. But just before the soldiers pull the trigger, they hear the girl sing, and they realize that she's a human being and not a zombie, and so the girl gets saved. Happy ending, right? But that felt earned because before that scene happens, we know what sacrifice the father had to put himself through to make sure that she survived. The father makes the ultimate sacrifice to make sure that his daughter is safe. So, had the daughter died at the end of the movie, the ending would have been just overly bleak. The audience needed reprieve, and so the girl had to survive. In Peninsula, however, not only do we not get a whole lot of character development, none of the major main characters dies. In fact, the only good guys in this movie who die are the brother-in-law and the mentally not altogether there soldier. And they've got such tiny roles in this movie, and they have no character development to speak of, that by the time their characters meet the ultimate end, the audience hasn't gotten to know them. The audience isn't invested in their characters at all. And so we don't feel their death is very important for the movie. Now this is when I'm going to pull the rug from underneath you. Despite the fact that I spent most of my time bashing this movie, I didn't really dislike this movie. Now I'm going to be straight up honest with you. I don't exactly know why I don't dislike this movie. It's entirely possible that it's because we're living in the age of the coronavirus and we don't get that many new movies as we used to. And it's entirely possible that because of that, I just want to like this movie. Maybe that's the reason why. I don't know. But that's just a random, unquantifiable thought that I had. More objectively speaking, if you consider this movie as a standalone film, and if you don't compare it to Train to Busan, it's a decent summer action movie. Yes, the movie does have its weaknesses, as I've pointed out, and it didn't surpass my expectations, but I suppose, if you're looking at it generously, it wasn't really that bad. And that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe and the notification bell. And if you've seen the movie and you want to share your thoughts, feel free to write them down in the comment section below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.